Today we're talking about why the S&P 500 is maybe not the perfect investment anymore that it has used to be, or at least it has been deemed to be. We're also going to go over some alternatives, other options you can maybe add besides your holdings in the S&P 500. If you don't know what the S&P 500 is, it's basically the 500 biggest companies in the US, and they're weighed in the index by their market cap. This basically means that the biggest companies are the ones that you're owning the most, and the smaller ones you own the least. This has worked well and arguably still is working and will work well because the biggest companies have been successful. That's why they are so big. They have also a lot of money that they can invest into technology, for example. And when a company succeeds, they usually get bigger, so they become a bit bigger part of the index. So if there's like a growth story of a small company that becomes huge, you're still getting into some of the profits of that. The S&P 500 is purely American companies, so it's not a worldwide index, but the Americas and the US has been on the winning side of the stock market in general for like the last 100 years. So if you would have invested in the S&P 500, you have definitely done well and you have gotten a great return, especially in the last 20 years or so. But what is bad about it then? Well, first of all, let's look at what is actually in the index. Here we have the S&P 500 index components by weight. And what we can see here that the 5 biggest positions are almost 25% of the whole index. This basically means when you buy the index, 25% of your money is in these 5 companies. Also, these companies are all tech companies that are in the US. They invest their money into pretty similar things. Right now it's AI. They have some businesses that are collide with each other. They're almost in the same sector for every one of them, and they're pretty similar in nature. These companies have done really well in the past, and to be honest, in my opinion, these are good companies and they will do great in the future, for the most part at least. But that does not mean that the valuations are fair right now. It does not mean that all of them will do exceptionally well in the future, and it does also make it that you have more risk in the index, because 25% of your money is in this. If technology takes a bit hit, or for example AI seems to be a bubble and they just keep on spending the money but they're not getting anything in return, these companies will not do that well and you're taking on that risk. Also, there's other things like the recent SpaceX listing, which was the biggest listing ever, and for even a non-profitable company, that is going to be one bigger part of the big part of the index. So you will also own that. Also, stocks like Tesla by the same dude, that is not really fairly valued. So there's kind of some shit sparkled in here, but it's not that deep because it's a pretty small position of the index, and you're not gonna get doomed by a 2% position in Tesla. And yeah, so the S&P 500 is and has done really well, and probably it will do well in the future, but that is not guaranteed. There is some bubblish valuations going around, and we can take a look at them next. This right here is the S&P 500 PE ratio. If you don't know what PE ratio is it is a price to earnings ratio. To understand it easily, it just basically means how many years will it take for you to get your money back, or to kind of double your money if the stock price stays the same. How many years does it take for the company to earn the amount that you're paying for the stock right now? It's one of the best valuations, the easiest, the most simple to use. The higher the value is, the worse the valuation of the company is, and the lower it is, the cheaper it is. Historically, the S&P 500 has hovered here around 10, 15. I would say around 15 would be a fair value to give to it. Currently, it is 32. That is really high. So if you think about it, it would take you, if the earnings stay the same, of course there is this idea that the revenue will go up, and that is why the valuation is high. But if the revenue does not go up and it stays the same that it currently is, it would take you 32 years to kind of get your money back, or to double your money in the S&P 500. That is a really, really long time, and for me, it could be better to just put the money into something else. For example, right now, the US 30-year bonds are at over 5% interest rate, which would get you to double your money in 20 years or even sooner. So you can see that the valuations are quite high. I'm not saying that the bonds are the perfect option because of the government debt and everything that is going around with it, and inflation and everything, but just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, bonds are usually the kind of safe asset class that is compared to stocks when it comes to returns, and when looking at it, the S&P 500 seems really expensive. Also, we can see that the valuation usually has come down. This right here is the financial crisis with the big ass spike. Then it fell back down to around 15. This right here is the 2000s.com bubble. This right here is COVID with the stimulus money, and this is where we're currently at. This does not mean that it will go up like this anytime soon, or does it not mean that it couldn't go up like this time anytime soon? It's really possible that it will go further and further up, and so will the S&P 500 price. So what could and should be done about this? The S&P 500, of course, is a great index for owning American stocks, but I think for most people it could make sense to go global. And I think that is the easiest route if you're trying to stay invested in stocks in general. And let's look at that now. Here we have the top holdings for the MSCI World Index. You can see they're the same. There is Nvidia, there's Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet, etc., etc. But the weights are not that big. The 5 biggest companies only are about 20% or a bit under. So you're breaking a little bit away from the US market, but it's still going to be mainly the US market because the biggest companies are US companies, and US has done so well for such a long time that the biggest companies are just in the US, and you're still getting them, and you're just getting a little bit of international companies, even though the first company is going to be 14th with the ASML holdings. But this is one example of an asset that is really similar to the S&P 500, but just gives you a little bit of diversification more than the S&P 500. But this is not the only option, and of course you not only have to own one single ETF or one single index fund. There's a lot of options that you can diversify your portfolio with. The first is going to be S&P 500 equal weight. There are ETFs and index funds like this that take all the S&P 500 stocks, but they give them all an equal weight. This means that you're owning every single one of the companies the same amount, which is going to be quite small. It's going to be like 0.2%. But this also means that even if a whole sector like the technology sector or all the big companies, they do really bad, it's still a small part of your portfolio, and so it's not gonna hurt you all that much. So what you can do, for example, is you can get the S&P 500 and then you can get the equal weight on top of that to get it more diversified in the bit smaller companies. But that is of course not the only way. What I also like are value index or value ETFs. What these usually do is they don't base the weight of the companies by their market size. They rather base it on a few different things. Mainly it's going to be the price to earnings ratio that we talked about before. It's going to be price to book ratio or PB. and price to sales, or PS. And also they oftentimes have a sort of spread that they're going to go into multiple sectors, because if they would only base by these fundamentals and these ratios, it easily would it get it to only go into a few sectors, which are, for example, airlines that are notorious for being really like bad at the bad times, and they often have crises. And for example, if you would go only by the ratios and valuations, you would be invested in companies that are near bankruptcy, because they have that added risk on top. So you usually have a few ways that they determine the holdings, but it's not just by market cap. One ETF that is this is going to be R-Series World Value Factor. Here you have the top holdings. Currently it has quite a big position in Micron. That is gonna be because they have bought in it earlier when the valuation was cheaper, and then it has risen, and also because they do have the limitations on the sectors. They needed to have a certain amount in the technology sector, and when some company becomes reasonable with the valuation, it usually makes it so that it's gonna eat a big part of the pie for that sector, if you get what I mean. So these are not perfect neither, but it's maybe worth it to have multiple different types of holdings. And these are one type of stock index that give you a different kind of diversification. And there's lots of these out there. I'm not really making clear suggestions. You should do your own research. There's always going to be documents and a lot of information online about the specific ETFs and index funds that you're investing into. I would definitely read them. Look at the fees. Those are the most important part. Then the taxation in your country. How does it work? Does it make sense for your current situation? The holdings, the risk, and does it have leverage? Those are things that you need to consider. But I'm just giving you ideas on what you could look for. And the next idea is going to be a commodity ETF. Commodities are gold, oil, grain, fertilizer, things that are actually needed and required in the real world to keep on living, to keep on producing, etc. and etc. So a commodity ETF or a fund could be compared to you, for example, stocking up on things that you need. Commodity ETFs are not really all that great for growth because they only own the physical things, and you're also paying a fee to the bank or to the provider to hold the physical belongings, or for them to own a financial instrument that is similar to owning or holding the assets. These have performed really well recently because of the Iran war. Of course, the oil price has gone up, and so has the gold price. And these are often big parts of the commodity ETFs or indexes. And so these have risen quite drastically. And that is what is actually great about them, because these usually perform the best in not ideal market circumstances. So if there's, for example, a war or a conflict of some sort, it's good to have these sort of things, because these will rise when the supply gets disrupted, for example. These also work against inflation. So these are definitely one point to take a look at. And if you want something that is gonna kind of go in the other direction as the stock markets, I would definitely, if you're a smaller investor, consider getting the assets actually for yourself instead. For example, getting a few gold bars or stocking up on toilet paper if you have the storage for it, or something like this can be a good investment as well. And for me, for example, I think owning, for example, physical gold is going to give you even more of a safety and security, because if something happens, shit happens, the internet goes down, or your government is gonna lock up the stock market so that you cannot sell your belongings from there, it might be nice to have some physical gold for the worst case scenario, which hopefully of course doesn't happen. Back again with the indexes, another great one that I really like is Built-on Global Fund Investment Bolag. It's basically a fund that invests itself into holding companies, investment companies. So it's gonna own Berkshire Hathaway, Constellation Software, Merkle, Fairfax, Alphabet, Exor, etc., which are really well diversified companies, which are global companies that diversify themselves into other sectors. And these are, of course, a great way to have some diversification as well. You probably heard of Berkshire Hathaway. It's great. They have a lot of cash at hand right now, but they're doing quite well, and they have a lot of stock holdings. They're a really, really big company, even a bit too big, so that's getting quite problematic for them. But investment companies in general are quite good because there are professionals working there to manage the portfolio. They oftentimes get really good deals on the companies that they're buying, and they have good diversification, so they can be kind of compared to owning an index fund, for example. I really like Berkshire Hathaway and Investor AB from Sweden. Those are two that I definitely do like. I also own Aker from Norway. This all makes sense for me because I'm a Finnish investor. And that is actually one thing that I want to talk about, is that you should take your current circumstance into consideration when investing. I see a lot of people in Finland that are into investing, and they have all their money in the S&P 500 and in the American stock market. And I get that because that's where the most of the returns have come in the recent tens of years, even 100 years. So that makes sense. But the dominance of US in everything, it's not a certain. There might be changes in that. About 200 years ago, people thought that the British were gonna rule the world till the end of time, and the stock markets and everything went really, really crazy there. Everything went up and it was all booming, but you don't see the British flags anymore everywhere, and British is not the undivided ruler of the world anymore. So there can be changes in what's going to happen in the world. There can be changes in everything, and especially with AI right now, nothing is for certain. So for me, I also own a lot of Finnish index funds, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish stock index funds. I also own some Europe. Emerging markets is a good one. Japan. There's a lot of things you can diversify into. My main point maybe being that you should diversify. You should try to hold multiple different types of assets, and I think the idea that putting everything to the S&P 500 with full leverage, everything that you got, I think that it's an outdated idea, and especially if you're old and looking to use the money soon, you should think about this a bit more than that. To end the video on a classic meme, don't take it too seriously. Investing should be something that you do on the side of your life while you're living your life. It should give you the ability to have money further down the line for you to use. It's not everything, and squeezing all the little percentages, even though fun and even rewarding, it's not all that necessary. And it's always good to remember that it's not really like possible to predict the future with 100% certainty. So it's fine to just put everything in the index fund or hold some in cash or whatever. It's, for me at least, it's sometimes really hard to even choose where to put my money into because everything seems to have crazy valuations or high fees, or there's always some reason to not invest into some place. But I think diversification is always good, and if you do make mistakes, that is always okay. And if you make a mistake, it's just important to learn from it and figure out why did you make a mistake and what can you do differently the next time. That's it for the video. Hopefully this helped someone out. I don't know, what are your thoughts? I'm always looking for new investment opportunities or ideas, so let me know down below in the comments. Yeah, that's it for the video. See ya.